Wonderful. We've got a significant number of folks in our room, so I'll go ahead and begin the program. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us tonight for our signature program, Lowe Connects. I want to remind you all that this session is being recorded. I'm Dr. Tola Porter, the Lowe Art Museum's educator for academic and public programs, and I'm delighted to have you with us tonight to hear about revolutionary things from the University of Miami's Associate Professor of History, Ashli White. I'd like to cover a few housekeeping items before we begin. First, I've enabled closed captions and live transcript so that if you click on your Zoom button that says show captions, it will give you the captions, or you can click on this little upward arrow and select live transcript, whichever is your preference. Also, at the end of the program, there will be time for a Q&A. And so when you have a question, go ahead and type it in the chat. We can hold on to those until the end of the program, and I promise to get through as many as possible. So that's the way to send in your questions. We have a strong lineup of exhibitions on view all through the summer, and we'd love to see you in the galleries. As a reminder, admission to the Lowe is free, thanks to the generosity of the Beaux-Arts organization. We are open Wednesday through Saturday from 10 to 4. And you can visit our website here or hover over this QR code to link into the website to learn more. I'd also like to highlight two programs that are coming up in August, and they're both virtual. The first is a slow-looking program in which we engage deeply as a group with two works of art. In this case, it's going to be a painting from Gauguin's early career and one from Monet's late career. This brief 30-minute lunchtime program is becoming a bit of a cult favorite by participants, so we invite you to come join us. Then at the end of August, Lowe Connects will, just like tonight, feature a new book from a University of Miami scholar. And frankly, it's hard to keep up with University of Miami scholarship. Assistant Professor Eziaku Nwakocha will talk about the intersection of fashion and spirit in contemporary Haitian voodoo, using two voodoo flags in the Lowe Art Museum's collection to open the discussion. You can register for these events on our website's events and calendar page. Now, with no further ado, let's get to tonight's program. University of Miami Associate Professor of History, Ashli White, will illuminate her ideas about the unique ways that a wide range of objects associated with the American, French, and Haitian revolutions crisscrossed the ocean and shaped how people understood contested concepts like equality, freedom, and solidarity. Beginning with an engraving from the Lowe's collection by James Gillray, White explains how these revolutionary things became a means through which diverse individuals, enslaved and free, women and men, poor and elite, promoted and sometimes tried to thwart the realization of these ideals on the ground. Professor White is a longtime collaborator with the Lowe, having taught several of her classes in the museum and collaborated on exhibitions. She's the author of the wonderful book she'll talk about tonight, Revolutionary Things, Material Culture and Politics in the Late 18th Century Atlantic World, and Encountering Revolution, Haiti and the Making of the Early Republic. She was the associate curator and co-author of the catalog for Antillean Visions, a 2018 exhibition at the Lowe that charted over 500 years of Caribbean maps. Her interest in the power of objects was first piqued when, as an undergraduate, she volunteered as a docent at her university's art museum. So now at this university's art museum, I turn the floor over to Ashli.
Excellent. Thank you so much to everyone at the Lowe for making this happen, and especially to Tola, who has coordinated this program so beautifully. And Throughout the program, you're going to hear me cueing Tola for slides with the word slide because Tola has the power over the PowerPoint. And this seems the most efficacious way to make it work online today. And thank you all for turning out virtually. And I look forward to your questions and comments at the end. And as Tola has suggested over the years, I have been very fortunate to collaborate with the Lowe in my teaching and with the 2018 exhibition Antillean Visions. And tonight, it is an honor to develop yet another tie to the museum, namely by exploring how its collections connect to my recent book about material culture in the age of Atlantic revolutions. And this evening, to ground our discussion in the Lowe's collection, I've chosen this etching by James Gillray, Dumourier in State at St. James's. A renowned British print artist, Gillray was and still is an undisputed master of visual satire. And in this print, his powers are on full display. This image dates from March 1793, just 1 month after France, in the thick of revolution, declared war on Britain. And fears of a French invasion of Britain grew, and Gilray's print illustrates its possible consequences. We see a ragged and skinny General Dumourier, the French Minister of War. He's seated on what resembles the British coronation throne, and he prepares to feast on the head of Prime Minister William Pitt, a broken crown, and a mitre. So in other words, Parliament, the monarchy, and the Church of England. The platters are not only decorated by frogs, which were associated with the French even in the 18th century, but they are also carried by members of the British political opposition, Priestley, Fox, and Sheridan, all of whom had expressed sympathy with the aims of French revolutionaries. Like Dumourier, they wear bonnet rouge and tricolor cockades, those little badges you see there on the hats, both of which were emblems of the political movement in France. Now, on the one hand, the message of Gilray's print seems clear. A French invasion abetted by British partisans would lead to the end of British government and the Church of England. On the other hand, the image's grotesque style and humor suggest that the British reaction to the French Revolution is hyperbolic. The caption reinforces this reading. With tongue firmly in cheek, Gillray dedicates his print to the Association for Preserving Property and Liberty, which was an organization established in November 1792. And according to Gillray, their aim was to hunt down and expose treasons in embryo. And while he professes himself an admirer of their loyal principles and truly classic publications, his sardonic language, coupled with the outrageous image, hint otherwise. Now, with Dumourier, Gillray indicts both French and British approaches to upholding, as the back of the chair states, libertas. In all of his work, Gillray was particularly adept at straddling political fences. But this evening, I want to propose that his print signals a more general trend in this era, that objects were active, unique, and ideological flexible agents in revolutions. Slide, please. In my book, I analyze how prints like Gilray's, but also some of the items featured in his image, uniforms, dress accessories, ceramics, furniture, how they inform debates during the American, French, and Haitian revolutions. In short, I explore how certain things became revolutionary. So the title is apt. Typically, we consider the political potential of material culture within the context of individual revolutions. In the United States, France, and Haiti, objects were an important means through which Republican regimes introduced fresh motifs and slogans as part of their endeavors to sweep out old governments and to establish the legitimacy of new ones. But we also know that these political movements transcended national borders, and so did material culture associated with them. As things with revolutionary affiliations circulated, they affected, rather than merely reflected, the contests at the heart of the American, French, and Haitian revolutions. These items shaped people's understandings of key concepts like equality, freedom, and solidarity. And individuals turn to material culture to promote and sometimes to thwart the realization of these ideals on the ground. Actors with sundry backgrounds, enslaved and free, women and men, poor and elite, they all found opportunities through objects to participate in seminal debates in the era. Now we can track the Atlantic movement of diverse categories of objects. So slide please, Tola. We have ceramics, metalware, and furniture. Next slide. Military clothing and accessories. There are maps and prints. Next slide. And finally, life-size wax figures. Now, some of these things originated at a revolutionary site and voyaged beyond it, while others were fabricated outside of the United States, France, and Haiti, but referenced those places. So for instance, British or American-made items about the French and Haitian revolutions, like Gillray's print that we started with. No matter their points of origin, these things bridged the North American and Francophone worlds at this decisive moment. And because it's kind of difficult to look at this slide, especially if you're eating during this talk, let's switch to the next slide. All right. Now, in locating the precise political impact of these assorted things, an object's genre mattered in at least three ways. So first, the traits unique to a type of object, so military clothing versus printed portraits for interest, they figured in its specific political capacity. So I explore how uniforms engage with questions over equality, whereas printed portraits influence debates about popular sovereignty. Second, not only did different objects speak to different issues, but each category had limits that were distinct to its form as well. These bounds were structural in terms of where and of what things were made. So an object's political possibilities were determined in part if it could be and was produced in Cap Français or Philadelphia or Paris, and whether it was comprised of cloth or paper or ceramic. But the limits of revolutionary things were also socially constructed, in that people had thresholds for tolerating alterations to aspects of their material world and to those of others. Some individuals were more willing and more able to change their dress accessories than their dinnerware. And lastly, on the importance of genre, context affected political influence. An object could promote or check change depending on who acquired and used it, how, where, and to what ends. A Queensware platter owned by an enslaved person in Virginia had political valences distinct from one found in Duke d'Orléans' household. Okay. Now, this tension across and within revolutionary things made them sites of contest as people teased out political prospects and encountered obdurate restrictions in the world of goods. I focus on this contest in the heat of the moment from about 1770 to 1810, when participants and observers wrestled with events, agents, and ideas as they surfaced. The quick succession of these three revolutions, and in the case of France and Haiti, their contemporaneity, they facilitate our inquiry into the effects of objects on the revolutionary present, instead of their role in, say, nationalism and commemorations of the revolutionary past. In so doing, I look to recover the dynamism of Atlantic revolutionary things for the many individuals who encountered and interacted with them. Now, to show this dynamism in action tonight, I want to consider one object long seen as emblematic of the French Revolution and one that features prominently in Gillray's print, and that's the tricolor cockade. Slide, please, Tola. Now, rosettes of ribbons have been worn as dress accessories in many places during the early modern period, but this specific version of the cockade and the political associations attributed to it were invented during the French Revolution. The story goes that Camille Desmoulins, in a rousing speech to crowds gathering to storm the Bastille, he suggested that they wear a bit of ribbon to distinguish one another and to symbolize the virtue of their goal. He recalled that initially he proposed green because of its associations to hope. A few days later, the color was changed to a combination of red to show as he put it, that they were ready to shed our blood, and blue for a heavenly constitution. Now, although Desmoulins did not survive the revolution, he was guillotined in 1794, his cockade did. Despite numerous regime changes in the 1790s, the tricolor cockade endured. Throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, leaders and supporters of the various iterations of the French Republic embraced the emblem and slide please. And more recently, as any die-hard soccer fan might point out, so you can see Emmanuel Macron, he wore the tricolor cockade as cufflinks to France's World Cup matches. So in sum, the tricolor cockade has become synonymous with France, so much so perhaps that we take its meaning for granted now and when it first emerged in the 18th century. Slide, please. Now, when scholars uncover evidence of an individual wearing a tricolor cockade in the 1790s, they interpret that accessory as demonstrating the person's sympathy with the French Revolution. But I want to suggest that its meaning is much less stable and much more interesting than that pat explanation. After all, during the Revolution and beyond, people in France and its empire vied to determine exactly what the French Republic was and who could be citizens in it. As a result of this contest, tricolor cockades generated controversy, depending on who wore them, where, and how. And as the French Revolution spilled out beyond its borders, disputes over cockades spread throughout Europe, the United States, and the Caribbean. Rather than repositories of fixed messages, cockades were open to numerous interpretations as different populations encountered them. In our exploration of cockades in an Atlantic context, we need to consider three important aspects: their emergence as a commodity in France and abroad, their centrality to warfare, and finally, the slipperiness of political identity in an age of revolution. All of these factors are evident in the journal of Benjamin Johnson, a Philadelphia printer and bookseller. In 1796, Johnson traveled to France with a delegation of fellow Quakers to visit a troubled meeting near Montpellier. The group took a circuitous route, making stops in England, Germany, and the Netherlands before finally reaching France. Along the way, Johnson critiqued the slave trade ships docked in Liverpool. He lamented the poor conditions and low pay of factory workers in Manchester and Sheffield. He celebrated the extension of citizenship to Jews in Amsterdam, and he caught a glimpse of the British royal family who, in his opinion, lacked, quote, dignity or any extraordinary capacity. All observations which were in keeping with some of the most radical views of the period. But as Johnson and his party drew closer to their destination, he became agitated by the prospect of donning a tricolor cockade. Slide, please. In his diary, he recounted the tense moments when the ship docked at the French coast. He noted that every passenger on board, except for himself and his Quaker companions, had cockades with them, either on their hats or in their pockets, ready to put on. Some offered to share their extra cockades with Johnson. When he declined, they advised that at the very least, he should carry a bit of three-colored ribbon to show any official who might stop him. Johnson lamented that he was not able, for want of their language, fully to explain his reason for declining this badge of war. Now, we might be tempted to attribute his refusal to his Americanness or his Quakerism, but the episode and Johnson's framing of it flags association with cockades that held true for diverse Atlantic actors. So let us now turn to examine each aspect: cockades as transnational goods, as military emblems, and as markers of political belonging. First, commodities. Johnson's account begs the question, how did his fellow passengers acquire tricolor cockades? Slide, please. French consumers could purchase tricolor cockades in shops, by subscription, and on the streets. They were in such demand that as early as the fall of 1789, the Anglophone press claimed that the French had spent, quote, nearly 1 million livres on cockades. Although the sum is probably inflated, the economic trend makes sense in a national context. As the tricolor cockade emerged as a popular emblem, French people bought a lot of them. But what about outside of France? According to one of Johnson's shipmates, a cockade was, quote, even more necessary than a passport. Many people knew they needed cockades to travel safely abroad. For those who failed to procure a cockade before arriving to France, vendors in port cities hawked them to newcomers as they disembarked. But most of Johnson's fellow passengers already had their cockades with extras to spare. And they came prepared and had the ability to do so because of the specific characteristics of cockades as things. Cockades were steady business during the Age of Revolutions in France and elsewhere, because in comparison to other types of wares, cockades were affordable for large swaths of the population. Although they could be found in wool or leather, the most common material for cockades was silk ribbon, and it cost less than a shilling a yard, which was more than enough to make a single cockade. The low price reflected a competitive market in which both Britain and France supported robust manufactories in Coventry and Saint-Étienne, respectively, and they supplied home and empire. Moreover, ribbon was a familiar embellishment because it was both an ornament and a fastener for men and women's clothing. Slide, please. As one visitor remarked about colonial Saint-Domingue, everyone from officials to merchants to townspeople were, quote, covered with ribbons. Some men tied their queues and shoes with lengths of ribbon, and it decorated men's hats and secured women's bonnets and caps quite elaborately, as you see in this image. But it also edged handkerchiefs and lapels. It circled necks and waists and dangled medallions, cameos, and other adornments. Now, anecdotal and visual sources testify to the assorted applications for ribbon, not only between the sexes, but also among people at all social levels. Most strikingly, some Black men and women appropriated ribbon in their dress in ways that served their own senses of sartorial expression. Slide, please. Late 18th century images show free and enslaved women of African descent trimming their hats, necks, and handkerchiefs with ribbon. While these depictions are idealized, textual evidence suggests that enslaved men and women purchased and used ribbon when they could. In 1783, a German soldier passing through Saint-Domingue observed that enslaved people bought produce to market and apply the profits to, as he put it, buy some trinkets like the finest ribbon, which gave them the satisfaction of being different from their poor comrades. Advertisements for runaway enslaved people in the Caribbean and the United States occasionally noted ribbon embellishments on their clothing, such as an enslaved barber in Kingston, Jamaica, who wore a fustian coatee lapel and edged with blue ribbon. Now, given the low cost of ribbon and its pervasiveness and extant dress practices, cockades were accessible articles with enormous potential for popular appeal. And sure enough, they turned up everywhere from the United States to the Caribbean to Europe. Although the tricolor is perhaps the most recognizable today, there was an astonishing variety of politicized cockades. In the late 1780s, one needed an orange cockade in Holland, and in the 1790s, it was adopted in Suriname and Curacao as well. The press warned that it would be extremely dangerous to refuse wearing the newly adopted green cockade in Ireland. The Polish patriots donned blue and green, Swiss colors were red, white, and green. But in an age of revolutions, the rules for appropriate cockades were anything but stable. In Martinique, for example, one American merchant advised in 1789 that, quote, every person to avoid incurring the displeasure of the people are obliged to wear the tricolor cockade. A few years later, counter-revolutionary forces demanded that the white cockade be worn, only to revert to the tricolor again when Republicans prevailed. From a maker's point of view, the fickleness of cockades was not necessarily a liability. The industry was built on novelty and the ability to respond to the vagaries of fashion, political or otherwise. For the wearer, however, the changeability of cockades was cause for concern. The wrong cockade, or in the case of our Quaker traveler, none at all, was a misstep that could provoke outrage and even land one in prison. At one point in his journey, Benjamin Jonson remarked dryly, quote, my curiosity to see a little dirty Flemish town was not strong enough to overpower my apprehension of being insulted for not wearing a cockade. I therefore stayed at home. Ambassadors and foreign agents who were exempt from wearing cockades in France took them up in the name of safety. James Harris, first Earl of Malmesbury, explained while on a diplomatic mission to the French Directory that it is impossible to appear in the streets without it. This language surrounding cockades, that of danger, displeasure, apprehension, that points to a significant characteristic that set cockades apart from ribbons of fashion, and that brings us to the second important aspect of their transnational political impact. Cockades, as Johnson reflected while on ship, were badges of war. One could argue that Johnson, as a pacifist, was attuned to anything that hinted at armed conflict, yet his observation was typical because in the 18th century, cockades' firmest affiliation was with the military. At a time when uniforms were not uniform, armies and navies relied on cockades as a quick and cheap means to identify soldiers and sailors. In the fog of battle, prominently displayed cockades helped to distinguish allies from adversaries or within one's own camp to incorporate foreign mercenaries and to differentiate among divisions. As cockades became a more visible presence among civilians during the Age of Revolutions, military connotations went with them. In France, the revolutionary government saw the tricolor cockade as central to the process of transforming all French men into citizen soldiers, as declared by the 1793 Constitution. Based on that logic, the National Assembly decreed that any cockade other than the tricolor was a sign of rebellion. During the Terror, when the Revolutionary Tribunal published lists of men and women condemned to the guillotine, slide please, they were accused of, along with other crimes, trampling the tricolor underfoot. And here you can see some soldiers supporting Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette trampling and tricolor cockades and even skewering one on a sword. Well into the late 1790s, this indictment held sway. In 1798, when Colonial Commissioner Léger Félicité Sonthonax appeared before the French legislature to justify his actions in Saint-Domingue, he alleged that André Rigaud, the rising leader in the southern part of the colony, quote, had trodden underfoot the Republican cockade and hoisted the standard of rebellion. To dishonor the cockade or to wear a different one was treasonous. While the French may have been the most vehement in this regard, cockades resonated as militant items in other areas of the Atlantic too. As Sonthonax's case suggests, metropolitan dynamics played out in the Caribbean. In early 1793, word reached the United States that discord overwhelmed the city of Pointe-à-Pitre in Guadeloupe, when residents wearing tricolor cockades came to blows with those supporting white ones. Meanwhile, in Jérémie, Saint-Domingue, colonists pinned black cockades on their hats in anticipation of invading British forces. In both these cases, and in many others, mounting or taking the cockade, as it was called, slide please, that marked the moment when men became soldiers, choosing sides and staking their lives on that decision. And here you can see in a print 3 recent recruits to the British Army, and they're not in uniform, but pinned to each of their hats is a cockade. Now, the cockade took on distinctive connotations in the Caribbean because of the presence of Black men. Slide, please. Several reports listed cockades as part of the arsenal for effecting war in the West Indies. When conspiracies were discovered among enslaved people in Dominica and Martinique, officials in both islands reported that they, quote, found stashes of firearms, ammunition, and French cockades among the ringleaders. Cockades, no doubt, carried ideological import for people of African descent. More on that shortly. But what I find interesting for this discussion about militarism is the way that cockades were essential vectors for translating ideals into military action. Slide, please. They were as indispensable as muskets and ammunition, and some white observers feared the consequences of the example. A white man in Charleston, South Carolina, reported that black sailors on French vessels had been spotted wearing the tricolor cockade. He asked apprehensively in an editorial, quote, "What effect must this produce on our slaves? Have we not every reason to fear it will make them very restless in their present situation?" Black men's tricolor cockades indicated not only their desire for liberty and equality, but also their willingness to act with force to realize them. The connection between militarism and cockades had important resonance for white women as well. Early on, stories circulated, slide please, about French women who took up arms and tricolor cockades in the name of revolution. These were patriotic tales meant to whip up enthusiasm for the cause. But women's cockades took a more troubling turn, especially from the perspective of male observers, in what came to be called the War of the Cockades. Slide, please. Women in Paris and elsewhere came to blows on the streets because of cockades. One account described an altercation in Les Halles, where a group of women tore the cockade from a female passerby. The victim, on leaving the market, had, according to this account, hardly proceeded 600 yards farther when she was again attacked by another furious set of women who beat her for appearing without cockade. The rancor among white women reached such a pitch by the fall of 1793 that the streets, squares, and marketplaces were, according to one account, strewn with ladies' hats, caps, and bonnets. It's an awesome image. Even among white men, these accessories bred polarizing and combative tendencies that some thought were getting out of hand. As our Quaker traveler no doubt had witnessed in the United States, many Democratic Republicans embraced the tricolor cockade, while Federalists called for the black. Throughout the 1790s, fights broke out in Charleston, Norfolk, Philadelphia, and New York, when one group spied the other's cockades and tried to remove or deface them. Frequently, the protagonists were identified as sailors, soldiers, visitors, or immigrants. In other instances, they were American civilians, and commentators in both political parties lamented this development. One wrote, "Citizens have no business with cockades. It is a military emblem which ought only to be worn by a soldier. To wear it as a badge of distinction is indiscreet and improper. It ought to be discountenanced by the citizens at large." Cockades were understood in this period as a bellicose incitement to violence. And if they spread among civilians, then civil war could result. No matter where these cockade-inspired outbursts erupted, critics cast them as the initiatives of unthinking mobs. Slide, please. And this was a familiar trope in the early modern period. This explanation attempted to dismiss the possible political impulses behind this violence, in that one influential ideological strand from the Age of Revolutions tied one's right to freedom and citizenship to one's willingness to fight and potentially die for them. In sum, a virtuous man fought for liberty and in the process proved himself worthy of the reward. Gender and racial hierarchies denied white women and Black people this capacity, and it was one justification for their continued political and social subjugation. So when white women and people of African descent wore cockades, they claimed the militarism seen as fundamental to enjoying rights, which many observers were unwilling to accept. As for white men who in theory could enjoy all that the cockade represented, their violence threatened to level social and political hierarchies to an extent that went too far for opponents and even for some revolutionary leaders. This discussion about the militarism of cockades brings us to a third and last aspect to consider, namely the ideological content of cockades. What precisely were cockade wearers claiming to stand for? In the Age of Revolutions, the answer to this question is less obvious than expected. Let's start with the basic issue of color. Specific colors had national significance, but the points of overlap, instances when two or more nations adopted the same colors, resulted in confusion and argument. Was the tricolor French or Haitian? Was it French or American? Were Black cockades British or American? Slide, please. Embellished cockades, like the one you see here, I'm hoping on your left, ones that incorporated additional motifs or slogans, they provided some precision as they highlighted specific aspects of political transformation. So a tricolor cockade with the image, say, of the French Constitution backed that moment of revolutionary reform. Or in the case of the United States, you'll find the addition of a silver eagle to a black cockade to celebrate federalism. At times, though, these elements failed to clarify a wearer's ideological stance, especially as cockades surfaced in different places. Consider one case from the Caribbean. In 1793, British prisoners escaped from Saint-Domingue to Cuba, and they brought with them a cockade, which they said had been in the hands of Black, quote, rebels. Documents describe the cockade's decoration in some detail. It was a little heart of grain bordered in gold, on one side a fleur-de-lis in the center, and on the other an inscription that reads, Constitution. The trio of symbols, slide please, recalls a phase of the French Revolution when demands for constitutional monarchy drove political reform. In 1790 and 1791, faience manufacturers produced wares painted with 3 flaming hearts, representing the 3 orders, slogans like the nation, the law, the king, and constitution, as well as fleur-de-lis, among other emblems. These designs fell out of favor with the execution of Louis XVI and the Jacobin turn in early 1793. So the appearance of this cockade in Saint-Domingue in the summer of 1793 is a bit of a puzzle. By then, Jacobin appointed commissioners led the colonial government, and the cockade found by the British men was out of step with current events in France as well as on the island. Observers at the time, who were familiar with the range of French revolutionary iconography, they interpreted this cockade as a device that endorsed the legitimacy of monarchy, albeit with some Republican elements. In this vein, this cockade complemented readings of the Haitian Revolution at the time that derided the ideological credentials of the enslaved by claiming that they had been and still were on the side of monarchy. They described the rebellion as a counter-revolution in which enslaved people, quote, believed in the imprisonment of the king, that he had issued them orders to arm themselves and to restore him to liberty. Opponents of the French Republican regime in Saint-Domingue and in France, they trotted out these arguments, especially when they spoke of Toussaint Louverture and other Black leaders' allegiances with the Spanish in the early 1790s. For the formerly enslaved, however, these symbols had different meanings. In Haitian Vodou, the heart would come to represent Erzuli, the deity of love and beauty. And perhaps the heart already had this affiliation by the late 18th century. And the cockade could have referenced that spiritual power for practitioners. As for the fleur-de-lis on the cockade, Black revolutionaries knew of its association with the French king. Throughout the colonial period, sites of authority, such as courthouses and official printed decrees, they featured the emblem. An enslaved person convicted of stealing or running away was branded on the shoulder with a fleur-de-lis. But not all allusions to royalty were negative for enslaved people, nor were their connotations limited to what white commentators at the time speculated. Several scholars have shown that enslaved people in Saint-Domingue and elsewhere had distinct ideas about kinship based on experiences in West Africa, and these understandings contributed to the organization and goals of Black revolutionaries during the Haitian Revolution and beyond. Jean-François, one of the early leaders of the liberation movement, he wore the cross of Saint Louis on his uniform, while those in his guard were decorated with the fleur-de-lis. In so doing, by taking these symbols, they appropriated for themselves the authority behind those emblems, and they deployed them to radical new ends. This flexibility, and in this specific case, the ability to incubate other meanings, and gave cockades enormous ideological and political power well beyond what makers intended. But as several commentators noticed at the time, the opposite was also true. Slide, please. Cockades were badges of conformity that signaled the limits of political identification. Think back to Johnson's shipmates. When they approached France, they put on the cockade as a matter of safety. It was a way to avoid trouble, whether they believed in the ideals associated with it or not. When the French government stipulated that all foreigners wear the cockade while in the country and that people in all newly incorporated territories embrace the emblem, there is in the very absolutism of such decrees a tacit recognition that the wearers may not espouse the ideals. One could argue that these laws were didactic. They were designed to help the wearer inculcate the Republican values that the cockade supposedly encapsulated. The Governor General in Guadeloupe made such a case when he requested that his superiors send thousands of cockades for distribution among Black soldiers, describing the cockades as, quote, little stimulants that produce great effects. Pedagogy sometimes fell short, though, and observers in Britain, France, and the United States, and the Caribbean, they pointed out the gap between what the cockade was supposed to signify and the character of the people who wore it. Slide, please. In Britain, some mocked cockaded heroes who played the soldier, but whose courage went only as deep as their ribbons. In Matthew Darley's famous Macaroni series of 1770s, his subjects were frequently bedecked with cascades of ribbon as a clear sign of their frivolity. Along with other outlandishly sized accoutrements, I have a feeling many of you have noticed the sword. The Marshall macaroni in this print has a flamboyant cockade that dwarfs the hat. It swallows it in tentacles of black silk ribbon. The caption reinforces the visual lampoon. Pray, sir, do you laugh at me? Clearly, the answer is yes. Darley exaggerated the cockade to deride military puffery, but the cockade charade critique had less humorous applications as well. Newspapers were littered with anecdotes of men who wore cockades to cloak their misdeeds, to escape from prison, to secure credit, to steal, to seduce young women. In these scenarios, a man used the cockade, an honorific trapping of a soldier, or as in France, a citizen soldier, to inveigle his way into someone's confidence and to take advantage of him or her. Wearers could be ideologically deficient too. After witnessing a Caribbean colonist beat a Black man in New York City, one commentator remarked, quote, "This Frenchman appears to me to be one of those who, while they honor the Republic with their mouth and decorate their hats with the tricolor cockade, retain all that despotism so prominent in the West Indies in their hearts." The author pivots from this episode to a reflection on the gap between what people wear and what they do. Let a man's professions be what they may, I cannot believe he has any real regard for genuine Republican principles, so long as he violates the strict law of nature and depriving his fellow creature of that liberty which every man undoubtedly has right and a capacity to enjoy. This editorial dates from 1795, a year after slavery had been legally and immediately abolished in the French Caribbean, and men of African descent there became citizens. The only reason then the Frenchman could continue to keep a man enslaved and to treat him with impunity is because he migrated to New York. The author hints that the real hypocrisy exists in the United States, whose laws abet the deprivation of Black people's liberty. A man of genuine Republican principles, when wearing a cockade, must support gradual manumission, which was then up for consideration in New York and finally passed in 1799. As this incident and indictment, as well as others indicate, cockades were not clear markers of political fidelity. Rather, they ran the gamut from banal to suspicious to avid. And in their very adaptability, they provided wearers opportunities to expand and to subvert revolutionary ideas. Slide, please. Through this exploration of cockades and their movements, we see that a small rosette of ribbon was far from simple. Cockades were powerful things for the ways they could gather people to act on their political loyalties, and revolutionary leaders relied on this capacity to propel their endeavors. But time and again, the accessibility of cockades as a commodity, combined with their militant connotations, extended the sphere of political participation in ways that made some revolutionaries and their opponents uncomfortable. Women, the enslaved, and the wrong kinds of white men could appropriate, broaden, and then act on the ideals associated with cockades, even when authorities thought these sectors of the population were not ready or never would be ready for political power. And yet, since cockades were markers of conformity, they emphasized the potential distance between conviction and appearance, an aspect of cockades that undercut their purpose and was exacerbated by their transnational movement. In sum, we cannot, nor could actors at the time, divide wearers into pro and anti-revolution camps, be it the Haitian, French, or American, based on cockades. And it is in this manner that cockades stand as an emblem of the age of revolutions, not for their tidy encapsulation of principles and political groups, but for the ways cockades, much like Gilray's print, manifested the instability, ambiguity, and tension of Atlantic revolutions as they happened. In the case of cockades, they reveal the messy process of assembling people in the name of ideals, and they show us how things afforded the unlettered, the subjugated, and the disenfranchised with ways to take revolutions into their own hands. In closing, I'd like to suggest that this material view on politics is important to interpretations of the US, French, and Haitian revolutions, because things were, and they still are, vital to human existence, perhaps more so than texts, the usual source for history of revolutionary politics. Whether enslaved or free, poor or elite, male or female, late 18th century individuals lived in material worlds in which people acted on things and were affected by them too. Given this fundamental condition, we cannot comprehend the achievements and the limitations of this defining era without taking seriously the consequences of things. Thanks so much for joining us, and I look forward to your questions.
Fantastic. Oh my goodness. Thank you, Ashli, so much. That talk was very rich. We have time for questions from the audience, and I'll send my question out in the chat to go ahead and type right into the chat if you've got things you want to explore more deeply with Ashli. But let me start with a question, since it'll give time for people to type. So you've talked a lot, of course, about cockades, but you showed many other materials in your slides. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how maybe the ceramics became politicized.
Sure. So in the book, I take a somewhat unusual approach to ceramics. Those of you who are into your late 18th century revolutionary material culture probably have seen ceramics similar to that faience plate I showed from the French Revolution, things that are emblazoned with Republican ideology. And we find these for the US Revolution, less so for the Haitian. And there's a reason for that structurally, but I'm happy to talk about that more at length. But actually, we know, ceramic scholars know, that those are a very small proportion of the ceramics that are being produced in this era. And so I think I show in that slide a fragment of a Wedgwood Queensware platter from the late 18th century, which was actually recovered from the Mulberry Row in Monticello, which is one of the places where enslaved people lived. And I trace actually how Wedgwood, with his creamware, not decorated at all with Republican iconography, takes advantage of the age of revolution to push out a product which we might think of as old, but as it reaches new places and falls into the hands of new people, like enslaved people at Monticello, it becomes a potential portal for upending some of the hierarchies of social, economic, and even political among various actors in the Caribbean, Europe, and the United States. So I play in this book about how some things that we might consider old, ancien regime, are actually new for some people. And just as we're creating revolutions, we also have to create the old. That's what revolutionaries are doing. What was so fashionable yesterday, they have to try and make old and ancien regime with all the things that suggests. So It's it's not your typical take, I would say, on ceramics, but one I find particularly powerful for the way that it includes numerous actors and suggests us to look more broadly about what could be a revolutionary thing depending on its context.
Mm, mm.
Thank you, Tola, for that question.
Fantastic. And oh, great. Here comes one. Um, Someone wanted to hear more about the labor and production of these goods. The cockade is easy to make, but something like
Mhm.
ceramics or more elaborate garment has a complex process of creation. Does that factor into how we might think about these objects? Does it give them part of their meaning?
Absolutely, it's essential. So I have to say, with each chapter, I begin by by telling people not only what it took to make certain genres of things, but also what it took to transport them across the Atlantic. That matters in terms of the scale of revolutionary things and where they could reach. I'm interested in things that were ubiquitous rather than one of a kind. So volume really matters to me. Um, and it also figures into kind of the power structure of objects. There's, as I suggested at the beginning, there's something the bounds around material culture's political politicization in an Atlantic context are in part structural, and that has to do where things were made. So in the case of ceramics, many of them are coming out of Europe, and that leads to that means that certain actors have more potential with production than others, right? More and accessibility too, right? Cockades, though, because they are easy to make and affordable, men and women had sewing skills in this period. That very production presents another view on how they can become politicized. Same with furniture, maps, and prints, how many we can trace, the ways that they're made, where they're made, that all matters a ton. So yes, I'm very attentive to the ways that production feeds into it. It helps me to substantiate um, the movement of these things, as well as why we need to pay closer attention to the specific type of thing, rather than just sort of lump them all together as say all having Republican ideology, therefore they all operate the same way. They don't. They have different potential based on genre.
Fabulous. I wonder, I couldn't help but notice in your talk the correlation between the cockade and a flag, national
Mhm.
flag, and not to take it too far out of the Revolutionary era and context, but could you speak a little bit about the way that they both signify and yeah.
Sure. So one of the things that comes along with the Age of Revolutions is the adoption of new colors and new flags to establish nations, right? I think the flag is that come along and are and somewhat debated over the course of each revolution is is more rooted in the national, I would say, than the cockades could be, at least in the era that I'm looking at. They become like the tricolor cockade for France, with which I kicked off. Like if Macron is wearing them as cufflinks, they're pretty solidly French. And the fact that they come to operate like the flag in France in the aftermath of the revolution and Napoleon, that gives it a kind of stability. And I guess, and for flags too, we see that happening, the Haitian flag, the US flag, etc. But I think what's interesting about the cockades is the ways that the colors might, for us, in hindsight, signal the flag. In the moment of the revolution, they're still deeply contested and controversial. So I guess one of the things I'm trying to do is unmoor our expectation of seeing a quick and clear through line. Like that when they appear, clearly they signal the nation. As they move, they don't, and they're still in this era something that is being fought over, argued about, and also what exactly it's supposed to represent or indicate is up for debate too. So for sure, like if I if I went on with some of these objects beyond the period, then I think we'd see a certain kind of maybe taming within a national context, right? More of a claim. But in the unsettled period I'm looking at, I'm kind of asking us to for us to see these as unsettled too. And it's in that climate that they're able to be not just markers, but actors and agents of debate.
Yeah, I love that, more deeply complicating something that reads as one thing today, but back then was much more complex. I wonder if there were other accessories that became politicized in this era besides just the cockade.
Sure. So one of the other things I look at are medallions. I think I
Mm,
showed the one from the anti-slave trade campaign, which were also important in this area because they were small. They were usually manufactured in Europe, but because they were small and relatively inexpensive, we know that they moved a lot. And to the point where they certainly reached the Caribbean, and they, I argue, sort of have an interesting correlation with the way that enslaved people were sometimes known to wear amulets in order to for their spiritual power, but also for their ways that they inspired action. They're frequently found, at least by white observers, during rebellions. And so it again is something that's intimate, that's proximate, that has a certain image, but that what appears on these medallions can become more mutable and open to interpretation in the ways that cockades could too.
I love that. I love that personal comment too, that they were personally used objects. Another person asks, and we have just probably enough for this time, enough for this question. Did the members of different political clubs distinguish themselves from one another through what they wore, like the Girondins, the Jacobins, the clubs of the
Mhm.
Revolutionary Women?
Yeah, there's quite a literature about dress and the revolution, clothing, and how certain things become a fad, like the sans culotte, right? Like that group is known for that emblematic uh, piece of clothing, right? And all that it signals. And there are ones that are much more flamboyant. But I think I too look at clothing in the book, but um, I don't look at I don't look at fashion, as it were, because I think very few people were able to turn over their wardrobes, had the economic wherewithal to keep up with revolutionary fashions. That's a small sector of the population who can jettison an expensive item of clothing like a coat in order to have what was seen as revolutionarily appropriate. Instead, what I focus in on are uniforms, which we know were produced by the hundreds of thousands in this period. And I'm really, and get on the backs of people of all sorts of social classes. So I'm interested in the ways that military clothing becomes a vehicle through which men begin to argue for rights. So there are changes and emblematic items of clothing associated with some groups, but it's, I would argue, not as pervasive as other articles of dress, like military clothing, which we see en masse in this era.
Wonderful. Given our time, I think we'll leave it there. And I just wanted to thank Ashli so much for this incredibly rich talk, and all of you for attending tonight and joining with us tonight, and the very good questions that you contributed to at the end. We would love your feedback on this program. You can hover over the QR code right here, right now with your phones, or also look for an email from us in the next day or so, and we'll send you a link to the survey. Thank you so much, everyone. I hope you have a wonderful night, and we'll see you next time at the Lowe.